Hello everybody. In this video you will see top 5 most asked questions from Marco Rubio at Senate hearing.
The biggest threat that we face is the United States.
The Communist Party of China that leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin, there's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places, but the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went. And I think you're alluding to it in your statement. I know you may have another question. I don't want to eat up all your time, but I do want to say this. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise. Now, they already are. They're going to be a rich and powerful country, and we're going to have to deal with them. The danger is that because of our own actions, in many cases, a dangerous imbalance is built up in that relationship. We allowed them for years to pretend that they were some developing countries, so we should allow them to continue to cheat on trade and commerce. We should allow them to continue to expand. They lied about not militarizing and populating island chains in the South China Sea and the like. We allowed them for years, before we got serious about it, to conduct grotesque human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims, as an example. One of the most horrifying things happening on the planet. And for years, no one talked about it, which, by the way, not just has a human rights component to it, it allows them to use slave labor to produce goods at the expense of the rest of the world. Talk about not just a horrific humanitarian crisis, but an unfair trade practice as well. We've allowed them to get away with things. And frankly, the Chinese did what any country in the world would do given these opportunities. They took advantage of it. And so I think now we're dealing with the ramifications of it. I agree 100% what you said, but I remind you, and I remind everyone, I guess I want to make this point, that much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
And, President Trump said recently that all hell will be to pay if the hostages aren't released. If confirmed, what emphasis would you put on releasing those hostages in Gaza? Do you agree that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza absolutely must include the release of those hostages?
Well, it must include it, because if it doesn't, there won't be a ceasefire for long. I mean, the Israeli commitment to bringing back their civilians, that's what these are. These are civilians. These are people, these are innocent people who were targeted and have been held in horrifying conditions, the health and well-being of which many of them we still don't know, but we believe there's a substantial number that are going to be released as part of this first tranche. And that's an important point as well. In regard to this agreement that has now been publicly reported on, it's not everyone. I think there's a first tranche of women, children, and people over a certain age, and then a second tranche of releases of males that are of military age, who they claim are all combatants, even though they are not. They just happen to be of a certain age. But without the hostage situation resolved, this situation will not be resolved. It is the linchpin of what's happened now. Hamas has been severely degraded. But these people, that include a number of American citizens, need to be home as soon as possible, and that will remain a priority in any engagement that we're involved in with regards to not just a ceasefire, but some permanent peace process moving forward.
Our companies face in China often the requirement for partnerships or location or what products they can produce or the theft of their intellectual property. Meanwhile, we're helping their economy by being a major supplier of fossil gas, LNG, to China. Should we be strengthening the Chinese economy by sending them LNG?
Well, I think that is a good point to raise in that regard, because I will tell you that is one of the things that's going to have to be discussed in the broader relationship with China. And that is, it is one of the things we actually export to China. They import a lot this way. One of the few things that we export is, in great capacity, is these long-term contracts that are tied up either directly to China or through third countries. Because some of this obviously is exported to a third country who in turn sends it to China either as a direct sale or as a byproduct. So I think that has to be on the table. as a number of other measures that we have in leverage as we engage the Chinese in this geopolitical perspective. I would go further and point out that the Chinese also have, I believe, the world's largest surplus refining capacity. They've invested very heavily in that as well. And that's one more area where I think our energy policy will be critical and bringing some geopolitical stability to our relationship with them.
Since October 7th, there's been a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, pro-terrorist violence in our cities, on college campuses. You and I had the opportunity to write an op-ed together. And in that op-ed, we called on foreign nationals who support Hamas or other terrorist organizations to lose their visas and to be sent back to their home countries. As Secretary of State, of course, you'll be responsible for overseeing the issuance of visas. How will you enforce our laws to ensure that we remove supporters of terrorist groups from our country?
Listen, my view on this is one of common sense. Okay? If you apply for a visa to come into the United States, and in the process of being looked at, it comes to light that you're a supporter of Hamas, we wouldn't let you in. If we knew you were a supporter of Hamas, we would not give you a visa. So now that you got the visa and you're inside the U.S., and now we realize you're a supporter of Hamas, we should remove your visa. If you could not come in because you're a supporter of Hamas, you should not be able to stay on a visa if you're a supporter of Hamas. That's how I view it. And I think that's just an issue of common sense. And we intend to be very forceful about that.
Good. Thank you.
Will you support in your role as Secretary of State Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And
let me just point out that on the Taiwan Relation Act, and I believe of the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple or consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear are our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan is anywhere near it. So this is just one more example of how they're being excluded. I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7-8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, and they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped, and others who have stayed strong in that regard.